research background and experience. He studied coyotes in Utah, spotted owls and mountain goats in Olympic National Park, pronghorn antelope on the National Bison Range, and then other research which you'll hear about tonight. He just finished his second year as professor in wildlife biology here at the University of Montana in the School of Forestry. So welcome and thank you for being here. Started.
So the song and dance that Paul and I are going to do tonight is that, well, we're going to aspire to leave you with two take-home messages. One is that it's good to be disturbed, and the other is that it's good to be decadent. Those are the two big messages that we hope that you'll go away with tonight. And so we'll do that. He'll take the first hour or so, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back, and I'll sort of do the second hour, and we'll try to leave a few minutes at the end for questions, although you should certainly not hesitate to throw your hand up and shout out questions at any point during the talk.
It's a bit of a challenge trying to get an overview of the ecology in an hour, but I guess what I thought I would try to do is talk about some of the major factors that influence the vegetation that's on the mountain, some of the things that control those patterns, and that will kind of set the stage for thinking about how wildlife interacts with the vegetation you see there. And definitely disturbance is a big element. I'd say that the two big factors that explain a lot of what goes on in that mountain are climate, basically, in all the different ways it influences things that ultimately explains a lot of what you see out there, and then disturbance on top of that. You know, those are the two factors that explain a lot of what plants are doing. So I thought maybe to get a context for that, we'd talk about, like, we talk about ecosystems. We think of, like, there's three aspects that characterize an ecosystem. Like, if you're starting out, your first question might be, what are the players? What are the species in an ecosystem? That'd be the first thing you need to know to get some idea of what's going on in the ecosystem. It's sort of a snapshot in time, but it's still useful. So we usually call that composition. We ask the question, you know, what are the species that compose an ecosystem? It gives you an idea of what's going on. You know, you're dealing with these evergreen trees, you're dealing with grasses, you're dealing with deciduous shrubs, things like that. And I would say one of the two general kinds of factors that influence that the most would be climate, and then nutrients, basically. And I'll keep on referring to that, but it really explains a lot of what goes on there. You know, it's kind of a tough climate here in Montana. It doesn't seem like it today, but for plants, they've got some pretty tough things to deal with. Very short growing season. Frost is very common throughout the year, and very little moisture. And so they've got some very tough stresses to deal with, and I think that's what really limits a lot of the species that you see around here. The other thing that's very important about ecosystems, and of course ecologists for many, many years, and they continue to be particularly fascinated with this question. Why are there so many species in the world, the biodiversity issue being one, and why do species occur one place and not another? You know, and so there's a lot you can learn about the ecosystem that way. But the structure in research, especially recently, has gained a lot of attention. People say, well, it's really not quite enough to just know what plants are out there to understand what's going on in the ecosystem. Just having a species list is helpful, but that's not quite enough to figure out what's going on there. If you also know what are the sizes of the plants and the shapes of the plants and how many layers of leaves and how tall are they, things like that, how dense is the vegetation, those things are pretty important, especially for figuring out how wildlife might be using a habitat in terms of forage, in terms of hiding cover. All those kinds of things become really, really important too. And then finally, usually what is often of greatest interest is generally when we talk about function, which is kind of a composite of all these things together. Function would be like cycling of nutrients, how fast the plants grow. Wildlife foraging could be a function in an ecosystem. To understand that, you need to know what is the structure of the vegetation and a bit what's the composition. And again, the climate is going to play a big role again. So that's kind of how they all interrelate in talking about these different ecosystems. Okay, well, I was going to start out talking about climate, and then I'll talk about disturbance. We all know at the big picture, climate determines the general kinds of ecosystems we have, whether in the tropics, the Arctic, or something like that. But it also, at very small scales, especially here in the Rockies, makes a really big difference. When you go up and down a mountain, the climate changes. Not only does it get a little bit cooler, but you usually get more rainfall, too. The mountains are picking up that rainfall the higher you get up. And so you're changing things when you go up a mountain and across a mountain, basically. And you'll see, as we go on our hike on Saturday, you'll see some of these changes, how the species consistently change as you go up and down the mountain in response to these very, very slight differences in climate. Because of the lack of rainfall around here, actually just knowing how much water is there explains a lot of what you see. Like in general, we might ask the question, why are there grasslands? Well, in general, grasslands occur where you have 15 inches of annual rainfall or less in this region. And so knowing that's just about the mean annual rainfall of Missoula, that tells you right away that you're right on the boundary of where a tree can physically survive, that it's so dry that really grasses have the upper hand. If you just go over Patty Canyon, just go up the road just a little bit, gain just a tiny little bit of elevation, get that influence of those surrounding mountains, you pick up a few more inches of rain. That's just enough to switch the balance so that you're into a ponderosa pine forest. And actually, you go very quickly into a larch forest. So it happens fairly quickly. Pine can grow in areas as little as 11 inches of rainfall. It's kind of amazing. Usually a pretty cold place where it doesn't evaporate much. And areas that are dominated strictly by pines can have as much as 15, 16 inches of rain. So it's just around where we are. Whereas Douglas fir, you're getting up to 20, 25 inches of rain. You get areas that are dominated by Douglas fir with pine and lots of other things too. And then finally, when you get a bunch more rain, more like 30 inches, something like that, you're into things like subalpine fir and spruce and species like that. So just knowing the annual rainfall, knowing where you are in the mountain, you usually can predict what is kind of the dominant tree you're dealing with. So then sort of the big picture, the long-term picture kind of explains what's going on. The other thing that changes a lot that you see is really dramatic around here in terms of climate. What's the other way we can change climate besides going up and down the mountain? Going at different sides of the mountain. Like around here, sometimes the south-facing slope will just be talus with a few grasses, and the north-facing slope will be a dense, impenetrable thicket of Douglas fir. So it's a fairly fantastic, effective aspect around here. Mount Jumbo, as I'll illustrate with the slides too, hopefully, these canyons become pretty important. Not only does it matter what side of the mountain you're on, but if you're in a little canyon, a little gully, that can really create a special environment that trees will really thrive in and other plants. So that becomes kind of a big deal. The other way you can change climate is through soils. Any of you gardeners have noticed that. If you have a deeper soil, you have a change in groundwater hydrology, that can completely change the picture. You can have trees that otherwise couldn't possibly grow here, can grow if they're right along the stream or in a deeper soil. Some of you went to Ray Calloway's talk. He probably mentioned this whole thing about moisture competition and exotics. Where you are makes a big difference in how profound an influence they may play on things. So that makes kind of a big difference too. And again, in the mountains around here, like I spent a lot of time on Mount Sentinel, so I'm hoping a lot of these things apply to Jumbo. I think in many ways they do. But like there, for example, you can get these talus areas, basically these really rocky canyons where there's essentially no soil. Really unique plant species occur there. That's usually the only place you can see some of the more interesting native species in that area, for example. So soils makes a huge difference in what you see in a very, very small matter of feet, very, very small scale. In general, we think of in Montana, the more moisture you have, the more diversity you have. It's so dry here that you get to these droughty sites, and you get very, very few species that can handle that extreme. You add a little bit of moisture, and you really can crank up the diversity quite a bit. One caveat for that, though, is in general, open places have more species than closed places. So like grasslands in general will have a lot more species than forests, for example, even though forests occur in moisture places. So you can't carry this rule a little bit too far. So it makes it kind of interesting. So basically that explains kind of the big picture of what we see. Why is Mount Jumbo mostly grassland? You know, I think it's mostly the effect of the combination of soils and the climate explains kind of what's going on. I wanted to talk about forests, but I thought before I talk about forests, I think the thing to keep in mind is, like Mount Jumbo especially, and the mountains around here, really are grasslands with little pockets of forest in them. You know, and so to think about the forest, you need to understand about the grassland that surrounds it. It's really a dynamic balance between those two. I think grasslands are really quite interesting. I've been really fascinated being here since I was in an area before where there were grasslands, and really kind of a special place. And I think from a conservation standpoint, certainly really quite critical. One of the more endangered ecosystems in the world, in fact, are grasslands. We hear a lot about forests because forests are really neat and there's big trees and they're quite spectacular, but actually these grasslands are sometimes some of the more unique ecosystems around. You know, we really disturb them quite heavily. It's not too many places in the world where you can find actually good examples of grassland. And that's true of the whole Pacific Northwest as well as most places in the world. Also, I think it's a really interesting idea. We're just getting some of this information now, but a lot of grassland people have argued that grasslands are like old-growth forests. You know, these grasses can grow forever. You know, they sprout and they resprout. You know, these rootstocks could be hundreds or thousands of years. And so you find some of these grass species aren't very good at recolonizing after disturbance, you know, at really catastrophic disturbance. You know, they don't have to, because they only have to get a few seedlings started every decade or century or whatever. And so I think that undermines some of the difficulty we've had in reestablishing some of these things. We want a quick fix. We say it's disturbed, okay, get some seed. That should fix it, right? Well, it often doesn't. And some of the reasons are that that isn't what they're evolved for. They evolved in a different situation, just like an old-growth forest isn't renewed right away either. So it's kind of an interesting deal. The other thing that's interesting about grasslands, I think, is in contrast to forests, quite a bit of the food that's made, you know, the carbon that's gained by these plants is available to wildlife, whereas in forests most of it is cellulose, kind of hard to digest, and so that makes it a really different system too. So there's a really big differences between these systems that makes it really amazing. Also in Jumbo you have actually a savanna type too. You know, we think of savannas as just being in, you know, East Africa or someplace, but technically, you know, when you have trees kind of growing out in a bunch of grassland, that's a savanna, and we've got some examples of that. We could argue about how natural those are. That we'll take about that a little bit, but that's another kind of unique feature of this place. Well, one question we could then ask is, okay, it's right near Missoula. Missoula gets about 15 inches of rain. We just said that's pretty much, you know, the zone where grasslands occur. Is it natural to have forests on Mount Jumbo? How natural are forests on Mount Jumbo? That might be a really good question. I think Scott was mentioning there's a photograph showing Mount Jumbo in town. Turn of the century shows very little forest. And I think there's a lot of historical accounts where they say both Sentinel and Jumbo had virtually no trees on them. And so you might reach a conclusion that maybe forests aren't a natural feature. It's just an artifact of our ability to eliminate disturbance from the mountain. We'll come back to that. I think that's a legitimate question. There's, you know, you can argue it a couple of different ways. So it comes to this general idea of disturbance, you know, and boy, I've had so many discussions with people about this. There's a lot of people take a lot of different ideas of what disturbance is. Sometimes the idea of disturbance is something that's really catastrophic. One time I was in Alaska talking to somebody about we really need to better emulate natural disturbance regimes, and to that person, you know, tree falling wasn't a disturbance regime. Disturbance regime was like Mount St. Helens. And so he thought it was quite ludicrous. We were talking about emulating natural disturbance. But no, disturbance can occur at all scales. And again, climate comes back into it, changes the role that disturbance plays. I think fire is the dominant disturbance we talk about here. And we talk about 3 different kinds of fires that occur in this area. I think are really important. I think people, I see it confused really a lot. So I'm just going to list them right now. The one you hear the most about is catastrophic fire. That's the one that always gets in the news headlines and Yellowstone National Park and things like that, where the fire just rages up the mountain, burns absolutely everything in its path, you know, and it's kind of hard to ignore. You know, that's one form of fire, which is relatively common in the Rockies, but in general, to have a catastrophic fire, you need a fair amount of fuel. It has to be continuous fuel so it can really develop a big fire. You know, like if you're in a really dry place, it's got little pockets of trees here and there, you can't really have a catastrophic fire generally because it stops as soon as it runs out of fuel, basically. So the other thing is you usually need enough moisture to develop that fuel. So catastrophic usually occurs a little higher elevation areas. There's a little bit more moisture and denser forests. That's why, like, again, Yellowstone is a classic example. Up in northwest Montana, that's a big deal. In Idaho, that's a big deal. The other kind of fire you hear about a lot around here, and so our example here would be like pine, lodgepole pine. Whereas the classic for ground fire would be ponderosa pine, you know, where you have a fire. So this catastrophic is very intense, but it isn't very frequent. It might occur every 50 years, 100 years. In the Pacific Coast, we talk about a 300 to 600 year interval between those kind of fires. So it's kind of infrequent. This kind of ground fire can be burn everything from every 2 years to maybe every 10 years, 15 years, something like that. So it's very frequent and generally isn't killing the trees. In this case, a lot of trees are killed. Ground fire, usually not a lot of trees are killed. You know, you might get some, but usually, especially we have these large trees, thick bark, they're not going to die under these ground fires, basically. So the ground fire is just going to kind of maintain the forest, keep it in a certain condition, whereas the catastrophic disturbance is going to change the forest. And depending on the climate and the seeds and everything in that particular year, that particular season, you might get a really different kind of forest here, whereas here you're keeping things kind of the same. So this was really nice. We had these two kinds of fire. We could describe things pretty well. That made the world pretty simple. But unfortunately, we found out that actually in western Montana, especially in places like Patty Canyon and northwest Montana and other places, we actually have another kind of regime. It's called mixed replacement. That's where it's kind of all of the above. You know, the fire moves through, it catastrophically burns a little pocket, then it turns into a ground fire, moves through some pine forest for a while, then it blows up into a catastrophic pocket again. And that's particularly common in Douglas fir. And I would imagine that a place like Mount Jumbo, you could make some argument for something between these two fire regimes would be natural in that mountain, depending on what climatic period you're talking about, okay? So anyway, so there's really different fire regimes. They generally respond to different climates. Different species are adapted to them to play really different roles. In one case is promoting change. Another case is kind of keeping things in a particular condition. And this other one could be either one, you know, and so it can shift around. So if you had shifting climate and shifting amounts of fuels due to other factors, then you can see how it could be kind of a complicated question, you know, is forest natural here, and what is natural, and what's really going on here? Okay. And I'd just like to just briefly mention, I mean, with fire, you read the paper, you see a lot of discussion on fire suppression and all the problems that's had, you know, keeping fires out of these systems where fires are a natural factor. And so there's a tendency to think that's all what we do is suppress fires. But actually, people have played all kinds of different roles in changing fire. You know, the Native Americans were actually quite good at promoting ground fires in many cases, keeping things the same or in a particular condition by burning things like every year, every spring or every fall, something like that. When Europeans first came to both this area and other areas in the world, they generally cleared a lot of land, and during settlement actually increased fire quite a bit. So some of the really catastrophic fires, turn of the century, are in many ways a product of what we did. It wasn't just a climatic thing. And then we really embarked on this ambitious program of suppressing fire with just incredible consequences, which we could talk about a long time. But I think one thing that's interesting to point out is fire suppression is not as effective, equally effective in these three kinds of fires. You know, what's the kind of fire that it's least effective for? Would you guess? It's pretty easy to put out a ground fire. If anybody's ever had a little grass fire in their backyard, you know, that's not too difficult to put out. When you've got, you know, 20-foot flames leaping up these trees, racing up the mountainside, that's where, you know, all the money goes in. You see the footage of the people with their bulldozers and the fire crews and stuff, but tend to be kind of difficult to stop catastrophic fires because they're driven by climate, you know, these very special conditions. And so it's very interesting that actually what fire suppression has mostly done is it's eliminated these kinds of fires, these lower two. So in Yellowstone, there used to be little fires, and fire suppression was able to eliminate those, but they didn't do a thing about the big fires. The big fires still came. And so around here, that could be quite a problem if we're mostly talking about ground fires in ponderosa pine forests. And it's had quite a profound influence because we may be able to really take that completely out of the ecosystem. So again, it depends on what you're talking about. You know, they talk about Yellowstone and they talk about ponderosa pine often in the same breath. And actually, they're really different situations. Okay? So that's sort of an overview. What I thought what we could do is maybe I'll show some slides and we can kind of illustrate some of these points a little bit more. And anybody has any questions, you know, fire away. Yes?
So are the controlled burns that the Forest Service does, they're trying to emulate ground fires kind of, right? I mean, they're trying to clear out the others, right?
Generally, the ones that you hear about, yeah. Because most of the concern has been these ecosystems, the ponderosa pine, that had a very frequent... See, there's another thing that goes on. Let's say fires occur every 5 to 10 years in ponderosa pine. And then in lodgepole, let's say in Yellowstone, there's some argument about it, but let's say it's something like 1 to 200 years is a fire return interval in Yellowstone. Okay, we've been suppressing fires since about 1935. So maybe we haven't even changed anything yet up here. You know, whereas here now, we're pretty far beyond the natural system. And so that's kind of where the emphasis has been. And then since ponderosa pine is generally where people have houses and, you know, there's more human pressures, really want to suppress the fires the most effectively, you know, all those things put the attention on the ponderosa pine. In fact, ponderosa pine was quite extensive in Montana. We might get the view that ponderosa pine only occurs like on the slopes, places like around here, Mount Jumbo and places like that. Actually, it was quite extensive in the past. And it's because of our suppression fire. We get the impression that Douglas fir is a dominant, when in fact ponderosa pine was once more common. But yeah, this is generally what the Forest Service is talking about. You know, the rattlesnake burns and some of these others. You know, they're mainly trying to reinstitute this kind of cycle, you know, to get back to the functioning of the ecosystem, cycling the nutrients a little better, opening up browse for wildlife and things like that, a lot of those kinds of functions. So yeah, that's generally what's going on, whereas the catastrophic, you know, it's kind of difficult to control that. We can increase catastrophic fire quite effectively, you know. I mean, if you have the right conditions and you light a match, you know, you can make catastrophic occur a little more reliably than nature would. You know, but it's kind of hard to go the other way. So, okay, before I go to slide, I just want to mention one other thing. Is there's quite a big debate in disturbance ecology in this region as to what really drives it. You know, we've talked about people, and people certainly play a very big role in fire. We can increase fire by lighting matches a lot, intentionally or not. You know, we can suppress fires. You know, putting in roads, you know, there can be a lot more fires coming in, things like that. We can change things that way. But also, the other thing that can influence fire is climate. You know, I think there's often a tendency to think, you know, everybody asks, well, what's the climate in Missoula? You say, well, it's 15 inches of rain, and it's got a mean annual temperature, blah, blah, blah. And then you ask somebody around here, what's the average year? You know, and nobody knows, unless you've been here more than 20 years or something like that. So the variation is kind of important. And in the life of a tree, it's quite important. I think as you trying to understand ecosystems, one of our greatest challenges is thinking like a tree, I think. You know, like a tree lives for 200, 300, 500 years. You know, they're dealing with a phenomenon that's very large scales of both time and space. And I think it's very easy to get the wrong idea of what's going on because we're looking at too narrow a window of either space or time. That steak is doing there. Let's see if this is going to work. But actually, climate variation, like we know that the glaciers are here 10,000 years ago. I mean, you know, we know climate does change in the big picture. There isn't a debate over that. But what I think is interesting is that climate appears to change even before the greenhouse effect on essentially all scales of time. And they can be profoundly important to these trees. Like, for example, just 200 years ago, we had what was called the Little Ice Age. You know, during the Little Ice Age in Alaska, Glacier Bay completely filled with ice. When Captain George Vancouver was exploring the west coast, he developed all these place names, you know, Icy Bay, Icy Strait, all these kinds of things that are kind of odd now because they're now lush forests. You know, but there are icebergs all over the place. And those glaciers in Glacier Bay melted very, very rapidly. It's just amazing. Europe had really cloudy summers. And here, 200 years ago, we had a cooler, wetter climate. So if you're a ponderosa pine, it's right on the edge between grassland and forest, it might have the upper hand. You know, we see a lot of pine forests that came in this period of time. And I believe in a lot of instances, the reason why when you cut these pine forests, they don't come to active pine could well be because the climate has changed. And it's just enough, since we're right at the edge, just a very, very slight change is enough to change it between a grassland and a forest. So it's been going on a long time. There's another thing called the medieval optimum. In medieval times, temperature is actually quite warm. And in Scandinavia, you could grow corn. In Fairbanks, you could grow great crops, you know, something that just isn't possible today. And so, you know, relatively slight changes in climate have had huge impacts on these plants. And so now think about fire. What about those changes? How might that influence which kind of fire regime we're talking about? You know, Little Ice Age, you might have had a lot more ground fires. You know, when you had these really warm temperatures, really catastrophic fires, really big fires. So that's another factor that influences a lot. And some of the people that study pollen are very quite adamant. They feel like they can explain the fires in Yellowstone quite adequately just on the basis of climate without making any consideration of what we've done to change that area. So it's a legitimate point. You know, the climate varies all the time. And these trees are quite old. You know, they go across these whole periods of climatic shifts. So, you know, it's very likely that when a new disturbance comes in, even though we think it's a quote-unquote natural disturbance, we might get a different ecosystem coming back just because of very slight changes in climate and other things we've done to change the environment. So it can really change things a lot. And you can go to the cause of some of these changes. It gets really kind of interesting. There's very, very slight eccentricities in the orbit of the Earth with respect to the sun that changes very slight amount of energy, and that's amplified by the atmosphere. Weird things go on. Volcanism. Some of the greatest extinctions on the Earth, we believe, were due to massive volcanism happening to occur at the same time. So those things can lead to all kinds of changes. So change is a natural thing. It really is. I mean, we change things pretty fast, but these plants and animals are certainly adapted to all kinds of changes at all kinds of scales. You know, I think that's what makes it really, really hard for these plants. Not only is it dry and there's lots of frost, but it's changing all the time. You know, so they've got to be really flexible. It's sort of a, actually I still need this tonight. It's hard to get very specialized. You know, if this year it's nice and warm and last year it was cold and rainy, you know, you just have to be very flexible. So everything has to be kind of a generalist in the plant world since it can't move. Okay, the more you look, the more you see in this. A lot of different things going on here. This is looking at jumbo from Sentinel, basically. And you can see all these dead trees right over here on the edge of Hellgate Canyon. Okay, when you go down into Hellgate Canyon, you're basically a north-facing slope. So it's really nice and moist. A lot of accumulation of fuels, a fairly dense forest. Or any of you have done that trail that kind of hikes down from the mountain into, hooks up the Kimmelliams Trail. And so when a fire was let go at about, what was it, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon in a very hot evening with a strong wind, it just roared up this mountain, and it was definitely a catastrophic fire in this Douglas fir forest. And so all those factors together kind of explain what went on there. So that was definitely catastrophic. And then you can see isolated pines and Douglas firs over here on the mountain itself, which are, you could consider a savanna maybe, but this would definitely be more of a ground fire kind of disturbance regime. And then you get on the back side and then you start getting some dense forests. One thing that can happen is if we're suppressing fire in these kinds of forests, we can actually very much expand the role of catastrophic fire. You know, if you let enough Douglas fir come in, you can actually let what was originally a ponderosa pine forest that was used to a ground fire regime go into a catastrophic disturbance regime. And that's kind of what we're experiencing now. These forests that were either mixed replacement or ground fire are now catastrophically burning because we've let so much of that fuel come in. So you can really change things. Then you just go just a little bit more into rattlesnake drainage and look at all the forest cover in there. Just a very slight increase in precipitation from the winds coming in and getting the mountains grabbing just a little bit more moisture. You get into a system that's predominantly Douglas fir, larch on north-facing slopes. You know, a really different kind of ecosystem. Okay, next. And I was going to say, one thing I wanted to talk about are ecotones. They're kind of a big deal in ecology, you know, the transition between one ecosystem and another. So we've got like a forest, grassland ecotone we're dealing with here. And when you're on the edges like that, I mean, edges have got a lot of causes to them, you know. Like there's basically the forest grassland edge generally has 2 or 3 main factors that might be influencing that. You know, one could be like a climatic one, like this is on the east side of the Rockies where you got a really dry country, you know, where it's way below the possibility for forests. And so as you steadily increase rainfall approaching the mountains, you get enough rainfall that the forest can start developing. But fire and disturbance can play a pretty key role in where exactly that transition lies. You know, if you have a fire right here, that could easily push things back. And the Cascades, Oregon, Washington, a lot of the timberline is a function of volcanic history more than it is of climate, for example. So there can be a lot of different things that influence ecotones. But they're very dynamic. If you're in an ecotone, that means you're kind of at the edge, the environmental edge of what a species can handle. And so disturbance could play a really big role in moving things around. If you're in the middle of a forest zone and you have a fire, things should just pop right back into forest quite readily. Same kind of disturbance right in the edge of the forest could push the grassland into what was formerly forest. So that's what makes it really interesting. These are the places with a very subtle global climate change we might expect really big changes. And our change in the fire regime could have really huge influences as well. So anyway, next slide. And the east side of Rockies, by the way, limber pine is playing the role of ponderosa essentially. It's the tree that has the ability to grow out in these dry places, which pine does here. And there's other places where you see similar things. This is a climatically very analogous area in northern Patagonia. It has a lot of similarities to what we see here, where you have this grassland forest transition. A lot of similar kinds of features that you see around here. And actually some of the flowers look similar too. Next slide. You know, and basically there isn't a huge amount of diversity in these forests compared to some other places, and I think just the climate is so extreme. When you think of, you know, the extremely short growing seasons you have to deal with, and low temperatures much of the year, and drought. You know, either one of those is pretty tough on plants, and they've got both to deal with. So subtle changes in topography and how the wind moves through can make really big differences. Again, people who are gardening probably know that depending where you are in Missoula, you can have drastically different results in what you can grow, just because of the way the wind moves around, the way the sun is shaded by local mountains and things like that. Well, on a mountain like Mount Jumbo, that's going to be quite important as well. Are you in a little canyon, a little pocket where cold air can gather? Are you on an open slope that's pretty well drained? All really.
Slide you showed, is that a wind pattern? Why there is more moisture? Just, I mean, it's a short
Mhm.
distance. That's
Yeah.
wind patterns.
Yeah, well, it's moisture is the big deal, but wind is the mechanism. Like if you've got a big mountain range and the wind is going over, you have a little bit of rain that spills right over the edge, and then it just rapidly goes out into grassland. You know, so that's kind of what's going on. It's a rain shadow, basically, when you get beyond. But there's a little, kind of a slop zone between the actual peak of the mountains and when you get the full drought. But yeah, and actually in Patagonia, it's at least as dramatic as it is on the east side of the Rockies, too. It's quite amazing. In the city of Bariloche, you go 20 miles one way, you're basically in desert with cactus growing. You go 20 miles the other way, you're into a rainforest. So it's amazing. Anyway, next slide. Well, there's a number of strategies plants can use to deal with these incredible stresses. One is you can be an early ephemeral. You know, the biscuit root is a really good example of that. You know, where basically there's usually some snow melt in the spring, and so there's usually quite a bit of moisture in the spring. And so if you can live your entire life cycle within a month or so, then you can essentially avoid drought. You don't have to have any abilities to deal with drought because there's plenty of moisture. And so there's a lot of native species that do this. They come out fairly early and try to complete their life cycle right away. And in fact, these biscuit roots, they're already set seed. They're already just about done, basically. And it took them less than a month to do so. So that's a pretty common strategy that you see on Mount Jumbo. Next slide. And that's a little bit later, but still basically the same strategy. Balsam root is pretty much relying on spring moisture to make it through the season. Okay, next slide. And right now, there's quite a bit of Clarkia in bloom, which has the ability to wait a little more moisture tolerance. You know, it can handle a little more uncertainty. It flowers just a little bit later. Not everything can flower at the same time. And then the grasses generally flower a little bit later. They have a much higher degree of drought tolerance than some of these other plants. And some of them can actually flower into the middle of the summer, even around Missoula. So they've got some pretty amazing characteristics. So a lot of the plants sort themselves out in terms of their ability to deal with drought and adaptations with moisture and temperature both. And that's why, you know, if you walk the trails every week or so, in the springtime, you'll see usually different species coming out just about every week. So they've really sorted themselves out in a very intricate way, dealing with these climatic stresses, basically. Next slide. And there's a couple strategies you don't generally see. Being an evergreen plant, you know, on the main slope of Jumbo is generally kind of a bad idea, you know, because you're putting a lot of energy to put those leaves in, and you've got to keep them alive. So you've got to have a certain minimal amount of moisture. And so, you know, this plant generally is more on a north-facing slope in a Douglas fir forest or something like that. It can be in grasslands, but usually a little more protection, a little more moisture, because that's kind of a tough thing to pull off. You know, it's highly desirable to do your whole thing early and then be able to go totally dormant like a grass does. Then it really doesn't matter how hot it is. Yes, that's Oregon grape. Yes. Next slide. And then if you look at the climatic patterns in Missoula, we do get quite a bit of rain in June and May, and in the fall too. And so there's a number of species in the grasslands around here that flower in the fall. This is knapweed, of course, and that's one of the reasons to its success. I mean, it can actually, has quite active in the fall when everything else has gone dormant. So he's very, very adaptable to taking every possible strategy to make a foothold around here. Next slide. Okay. Another strategy you don't see in the mountain are deciduous trees. This is a particularly bad idea in this climate because deciduous trees, you know, usually trees take a while for their buds to activate in the spring. You know, they're usually coming out like right now or maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, something like that. And so it's already into the summer. And so the leaves are out mostly during the summer drought is usually how it works out. And so if the only time you can gather light, make food, supply energy for the whole year is during the drought, and you've got to sustain this very thin, sucking a leaf, and that's a pretty tough proposition in a dry climate. So that's why you only see these guys on pretty wet places, right along streams, really wet soils, things like that. So that strategy isn't one you're going to see very often. Okay, next slide. And canyons, I think, are really important to these mountains around here. You get these little canyons, and they do a whole bunch of things. You know, basically the cool air comes down and can collect in these canyons. It stays cooler and moister, and so even if it gets really hot in the afternoon, the plants have got maybe half the day where conditions are pretty good and they can grow. You know, a lot of these trees will basically grow in the morning and they shut down in the afternoon when it gets too dry. And so these canyons really can make all the difference between being able to support a tree, an evergreen tree, and only being able to have a grassland. Now, one of the problems, I think, is when we start thinking about disturbance. You know, like it's really dry, so you can only get these pines, but then you get these canyons that have got all this other vegetation growing in. And once you get a couple of these pines or Douglas firs growing in, then Douglas firs can grow in under them. And now you've got a little bit of a thicket. And if your fire starts from the bottom, as it typically does, it can just roar up these canyons. And so I think that's another thing that makes this question of the naturalness of forests a really difficult one, you know, because they've got a lot of things that are against them growing on this mountain. You know, it's pretty dry. They've got to deal with this climatic variation. And then when these fires come, they come roaring up the only place that they can grow, basically. And so, you know, I think that's a lot of the reason why, you know, it was quite a barren mountain in the past, because you've put a lot of humid ignition in there, and it could be pretty easy to eliminate some of these canyon forests, even if they have a sparse amount of fuel. But anyway, those are an important feature. We'll have to look at that on Saturday, check it out. And of course, there's a lot of other species associated with them as well. Next slide. So we're kind of going up the mountain. You know, we can get into the Ponderosa pine forest, a little more lush forest. And most of them around here are pretty dense. You know, and they've got a lot of Douglas fir coming in with them. You know, that's a really common feature. As far as we can tell, most of the historical accounts suggest that these pretty open forests that frequent fire, you know, you could easily ride a horse through a ponderosa pine forest, which sometimes is a little more difficult because of all that Douglas fir. And soon as a pine can get up above a certain size, it gets the bark thick enough that actually it can sustain a fire pretty well. And the other thing that's the advantage of pines is branches grow up pretty high. So you can have a ground fire and it's not going to kill any living branches on these trees. Whereas something like, well, a young tree like this little pine, you know, is going to get zapped even with a relatively small ground fire. And Douglas fir also, the branches come all the way down. And so if you put Douglas firs in with pines, then what would have otherwise been an innocuous ground fire can actually raise up into the canopy and actually become a catastrophic fire. So that's kind of some of the ways that we've changed things by allowing a little more fir to come in. We could think of the same thing happening climatically. If you had a cool period, cool wet period, same thing could happen. And so you might have a period of catastrophic fires until the climate's changed again. Next slide. And when you get into these forests, it really changes things for plants. You know, if you've got a bunch of these evergreen trees, you could think of them as water pumps. You know, if you had no vegetation, there'd be evaporation just in the surface of soil, but not very much. You know, most of the water would still be contained inside the soil. You know, when you have plants, they can really pump the water out of the soil. So that's one of the big functions they play. So the humidity will be a lot higher under one of these evergreen forests. You don't get the direct sunlight as much, so it's more humid. It's a little cooler in the summer, a little warmer in the wintertime compared to open areas. So that can make all the difference for species like arnica and some of these other plants that are really keyed into these shady environments. They don't really like shade, but they can outcompete other plants in a shady environment, basically. And you can actually find these, like in Sentinel, you can sometimes find some of these arnicas in the shade of like a particularly robust chokecherry and things like that. They're playing a similar role to the pine trees. Okay, next slide. Then if you go up the mountain, it just gets even denser, basically. You know, you can get these very dense forests. You start getting a transition between Douglas fir and subalpine fir and some of these other species. Now your situation, the fuel is so dense that you know, you're into it's going to take an incredible drought for this forest to dry out enough that it's going to burn. And so then you're in a situation where if it's going to burn at all, the whole thing's going to burn. It's sort of a catastrophic situation. So that's generally what happens when you go up the mountain. Okay, next slide. Okay. And larch is kind of an interesting species. It's common near Mount Jumbo, but I don't think it's on the mountain. It's certainly not in Sentinel either. It needs just a little bit more moisture. And it also, I don't think we completely understand it, but it seems to really like these north-facing slopes. You know, a broad range of elevations and north-facing slopes. If you drive over Lolo Pass, you can really see that. It's really quite amazing. So it's an amazing tree. It appears to depend on fire for germination. And then it also needs a lot of light. So it's a perfect candidate for a mixed replacement fire regime or a catastrophic fire regime. That's where it will really do well. You know, you're not going to get it growing under a pine, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't take much. In fact, there's cedar, you know, near Missoula too. You know, some of the river valleys. So, yeah, I know you can find a lot if you go to just the right place. You know, you can find a lot of these species, right?
Actually, at the north end of Jumbo, just about 3 miles of the National Recreation Area, where it turns into really north facing.
And there it is, yeah, faithful to its habitat. That's great. Next slide.
Does that content have anything to do with the intensity of fires too? I mean, as you get up higher, you get into the subalpine fir, and there's a lot, to me, I mean, from my experience, there's a lot more sap in those trees.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering if that has anything to do with the fires being more intense, because that stuff is very, you know, volatile.
It could well. We think you know, you can basically describe that pattern just by knowing what the rainfall is and knowing what the fuel distribution is, but sap could add to it. Easily could. Yeah. No, that's true. Well, it's like ponderosa pine. You know, the needles are highly flammable. You know, it's in its own interest to burn every few years to get ahead of its competitors, basically. And so you see that a lot. You know, trees that actually promote fire, they're dependent on fire, whereas trees that are not dependent on fire, not having those kind of volatiles. So, yeah. Although in the alpine, the fire return intervals is sometimes quite long. The subalpine fir, you know, often, you know, 50, 100 years or more. You know, and so that's kind of interesting.
Those places are generally more moist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, like you said, it takes take a drought for them to dry out.
Right. Well, and the other thing that's really kind of fun is if you walk along a stream, you can see plants, you know, all the alpine and subalpine plants will often grow in a stream, right along a stream, you know, because you've got a moist, cool situation. So it's like what they would find thousands of feet further on up the mountain. So subalpine fir can be found, you know, like I know it's in Petty Canyon, you can find subalpine fir right along the streams in fairly dense thickets, even though it's supposed to be, you know, on top of mountains. So, yeah, you see that a lot. Right, and then along Clark Fork and the Hellgate Canyon, you can see some of that too. Yeah, it's a good point. Okay, all right, next. I think I'm just about done. Yeah, so then the classic catastrophic fire just roaring up the mountain, burns everything up. I mean, that can happen. Well, we saw it happen in Hellgate Canyon. You know, it certainly can happen. We have a fuels buildup. I think it could happen in some of the little canyons, Mount Jumbo and Sentinel as well. And but it can recover quite fast. And this is Yellowstone, you know, and basically it's just a very lush green carpet just a couple of years after these fires. So they're very much adapted. These plants have to be adapted. In fact, if you think about all these shrubs that grow in these forests around here, Peter Stickney did a little survey, and essentially all of them are capable of resprouting after fire. You know, they all have that adaptation. So they generally benefit, just like a pine would, with having that fire coming in the system. Next slide. Okay, this is also in Yellowstone, but this is a little moister place, and here you had more of a ground fire and mixed replacement fire. There's a lot of charring on the trees, but you know, very little mortality in the trees. So this very much rejuvenated the understory, but really didn't change the composition of the forest very much. And these are all very close to one another, so just a very subtle change in climate and history. Next slide. And one of the big things that's happened on both mountains is with the exclusion of fire, a lot of shrubs are colonizing these areas. You're seeing a lot more of the roses, cherries, serviceberry is extremely large now, which is great. I mean, the berries are really great, but you know, as far as we can tell, it's somewhat unnatural, at least from what we understand what's happened in the last 100 years. And so a lot of the, when you look up and look at Sentinel, you see all the shrubs in the gullies and in the slopes. You know, we think that's a change in the environment. And it was certainly good for some species, bad for others, but certainly is an important signal of things are really changing in that mountain really fast. Next slide. What was my last one? Yeah, and cherries I was going to talk about. Yeah, there's a lot of cherries and serviceberry moving in the mountain, doing very well without a catastrophic, without the kind of fire that we think was very typical of these systems in the past. So things are really changing. You know, I think sometimes people make the leap that to restore natural processes, to restore fire to what we think it was naturally done, should also lead to maximizing biological diversity and all the species we care about. You know, it isn't necessarily the case. You know, what we often find is that we're changing the environment, and so it's going to be better for some things and worse for others. And it's not quite as simple that everything always comes out in one direction. Often adding more shrubs on a mountainside, for example, might actually increase the diversity of the mountain, even though we might argue that that's somewhat unnatural. So it's kind of interesting how it all links together.
Somebody thought what might be the effect of burning, where you've got the exotics coming in?
Mm-hmm.
Would the exotics be able to come back or not?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I mean, yeah, basically the exotics don't have to have disturbance. Like spotted knapweed is invading meadows in Glacier Park that have essentially no disturbance. So it doesn't require disturbance. But the exotics generally love disturbance, you know, and if you burn an area, like a lot of people will think, well, gee, I would like to be natural. I hate herbicides. You've got a ranch or something. Let's just burn the grassland. And that would just be a much nicer way to control knapweed. Well, it provides wonderful habitat for, you know, this very long list of exotic species, sulfur cinquefoil and knapweed and spurge. You know, all those species just love disturbance. And they're more aggressive at colonizing it than our natives. Like I mentioned, a lot of our native grasses would really like to get back. The fescues in particular, rough fescue, you know, they're more like old growth species in a sense. You know, they're not very aggressive at recolonizing after disturbance. You know, cheatgrass, spotted knapweed, all those things are very aggressive. So yeah, so if you want to reintroduce fire, if you want to do both things, if you'd like to not have exotics and you want natural processes, then you usually have to do something like you'd have to do something about the exotic species before you burn. You know, like if, let's say your patch didn't have too many exotics, but your neighbor was just totally loaded with spotted knapweed, you'd have to do something about the spotted knapweed before you burned your place. Otherwise, you'd get totally infested. So it's a huge challenge, you know, dealing with those species. In fact, I think exotic species are one of the most ecologically challenging dilemmas facing this region. You know, they're great competitors. You could argue it's a natural process. They're good competitors. They're taking over. And so it's going to take a huge amount of effort to reverse this basic natural process. Big challenge. Okay. All right. Well, we should, any other questions? Maybe we should take a break.